Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Lynne the other day and we talked about some of the tips that she had regarding character design for tabletop role-playing games. I'm going to jump across to that interview in just a moment, but first, remember to subscribe to the Chaosium YouTube channel. It helps us out and it lets us make more content like this. Thanks.
You've got to allow the people using those characters a certain degree of leeway because they're going to want to put their own spin on them. So, I love creating NPCs. I quite often spend way too much time actually doing the research to try and make their backgrounds interesting and believable than I probably should do, but it's fun. So, but as we've talked about before, you never quite know how someone is then going to use that person. So you do have to allow a certain degree of latitude and a lot of wiggle room so that the keeper can then put their own spin on that person, take what they like, ignore what they don't like, big up certain aspects of that. So, I try to make them interesting and believable, but not set in stone.
So it's that balancing act between giving players enough to work with, but also enough to be excited about.
Yeah, yeah, because you've got to, the keeper's got a lot of balls in the air. They're juggling the plot, they're juggling the NPCs. So you need to try and give them rich NPCs that they can immediately get a handle on, but then they're not going to have to put too much effort into fleshing them out. So it's an incredibly careful balancing act of how much information is enough to support the keeper without giving them reams of detail that is just going to bog down gameplay as they're trying to check absolutely everything to make sure that they're, doing that character right.
Obviously, a big part of tabletop role-playing games is creating your own PCs, creating your own characters. How similar is the process of creating NPCs for a campaign or a scenario as actually creating your own player character for a game?
I think one of the reasons, again, why it sometimes takes me a little bit longer than it possibly should with NPCs is that I like to try and create them so that they would be fun to play as investigators, so that you could see them stepping into the breach if all else, if everything goes horribly wrong, as it occasionally does in a Call of Cthulhu game, oh, well, there's all these people over here that we could just, very carefully tweak, give them some background information, give them some extra skill points so that we can personalize them a bit. Okay, there you go. They're ready to go.
How have you found in general designing your NPCs? You said that you spend a little bit too much time on it. So is it something that you're attached to? It's something you enjoy? Or does it suck up an unreasonable amount of your time and you feel trapped by it?
Sometimes depends when the deadline is. If that deadline is looming, yes. And if you've got a lot to do as well. I mean, Children of Fear is an example. There's a lot of NPCs in that book. There's also that entire chapter of generic NPCs at the back that are there to help the keeper so that if you need a random person from who does this particular thing, you don't have to bother creating one. You can just go grab one out the back there. Because it's a historical game, characters have to feel real, so you have to do a certain amount of research to make sure that you're not putting someone who couldn't feasibly or reasonably have been in a place at that time. I mean, look, it's a game, you've got monsters, you do have a certain amount of latitude that you wouldn't have if you were writing, say, a historical textbook, but they've still got to feel like they could be there, because if they don't, that's going to break your immersion. So that does take a little bit of research. The amount of time I spend researching location specific and accurate names is probably ridiculous.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the character design process for Children of Fear? Obviously, there's a wealth of characters in the campaign. Did any of the core characters come to you later than you expected? Were there any big changes that came through at the last moment? What's the story of how you designed the NPCs for that game?
Well, obviously, when you're designing something this big, you have your pitch, you have your outline document. And with all good outline documents, it's basically there to give you ideas. And then as you're writing, other things start dawning on you and you start to diverge slightly further away from it. So, I mean, certainly with me, I don't necessarily have all of the characters in mind at the very start. And because I did the book chapter by chapter, I was obviously I had the characters that I knew were going to be going all the way through. So that's the big bads and Tenzin and Kalsang. They're there, they're in the whole thing. you get those sorted first. But then it was very much on a chapter by chapter basis of, well, who do I need? What are the clues? Who do I need to be able to impart that information to the player characters? Who else could be there to complicate matters? Who else would reasonably be there that they might go talk to? I mean, I can't cover every option, but you have to try and give the keeper support in that space as well. Again, that's one of the reasons why that appendix of random generic NPCs is at the back there. And then I start then figuring out, well, this person has to be in this place doing this. So who could that feasibly be? Who would be an interesting person for them to talk to? What does that person look like? What do they sound like? Where are they from? What's their experience? That kind of thing. Would this make an interesting investigator if everything goes horribly wrong?
Yeah. Is there a pitfall that, a particular difficulty that you found creating the characters for Children of Fear?
It was just because there's so many of them, to try and keep them varied. And trying not to fall back on too many tropes and cliches, which when you're creating a lot of characters, you can occasionally fall into, because your brain starts to go numb after a while. And I think one thing that did actually help Children of Fear in that respect was the amount of time it took to actually write the thing, because I kept having breaks from it. So partly I had to check to go back to make sure I wasn't doing exactly the same thing again, having totally forgotten what I'd done. But the other thing was it did mean that I wasn't constantly trying to create this huge array of people all at the same time.
Speaking of cliche, I'd like to talk about creating villains. You've mentioned that one of your core points is, you create something that is fun to play as an investigator. Do you sort of have that approach to villains too? Do you try to make them a hero that has changed?
Not necessarily a hero that's changed, but somebody that if you got to play that role, would you actually enjoy playing that role? Occasionally, when I've been gaming, both in live role playing and tabletop, where we've had scenes or scenarios where, for whatever reason, the players have actually taken on roles of NPCs to support another investigator or another player character's story. So kind of like a flashback thing, say. And I've got to play two villains, and they were great. That was a huge amount of fun. I really loved. One was a very naughty German lady in World War II called Eloise, who was trying to convince her former lover to ditch the British spy effort and run away with her to South America, which was awesome. I thoroughly enjoyed myself with that one. And the other one was a very naughty goblin a couple of weeks ago in our homebrew game on a Friday night. Um,
Oh,
so
wow.
it's like, would these, if you got to do that kind of thing, if you got to do that where you have one or two people playing their PCs and all the other players playing the bad guys, would they be a fun person to play as well? Would they be believable? I mean, okay, it's 1920s and it does have the pulp option where you can go for the full mustache twirling thing for a couple of them, which is always great fun. But again, it's still that same sort of underlying thing. Is this an interesting person? Would they be fun to play as an investigator if you were doing the evil campaign? And are they genuine? Could you see someone doing that kind of thing? And I'm not necessarily, every bad guy is a misunderstood anti-hero, because some people are just irredeemably unpleasant and nasty. But I still think you can make bad guys interesting without making them tragically misunderstood.
Do you have a favorite NPC or PC that you have created in Children of Fear or in any of your previous work?
I'm very fond of Sophie and Bazaz Wine, the Indian photojournalist, and Chang Mei. Just because partly because of Caleb Cleveland's artwork. Caleb did a beautiful piece of chapter artwork for one of the later chapters in the book, which really sold the relationship between those two pre-gen investigators who, if nobody plays them, they effectively aren't. Well, he can be an NPC at the beginning of the campaign if no one chooses him as a pre-gen. And yeah, I just have a real soft spot for the pair of those in that particular campaign. To be fair, I have a soft spot for most of them. And one of the things that I do is no NPC I create is ever entirely based on someone I know, but there's usually aspects of people I know in there, just because, again, sometimes, you know how artists work from photo references to get poses and things right? Sometimes it helps to just put personality quirks in or bits of background history from people in, just so that, you know, again, it helps sell that believability, that the realness of that person.